right. Welcome everyone to this breakout session. This is session number 242, and thank you all for coming. We'd encourage you to wear your mask during the session so that our presenters don't have to. We have two great presenters today. First, we have Scott A. Roberson. He graduated from the University of Missouri at Columbia with a degree in biology in 1975, and from UMKC School of Dentistry in 1979, and started practice in Independence, Missouri. So you're local. Right. Yeah, that's great. And our second presenter today is Addams. He's a lifetime Mormon history enthusiast and independent historian and author. He's recently completed his 20th year as a volunteer Institute of Religion director. He holds a bachelor's degree in accounting and an MBA from the University of Utah and is happily retired. He's written for multiple journals, including Journal of Mormon History, John Whitmer Historical Association, Mormon Historical Studies, among others. He's a past president of the John Whitmer Historical Association. So with that, we'll turn the time over to Scott. Thank you.
Thank you. So over the past 25 plus years, as I've attended John Whitmer and read about church history, I started to notice a pattern. There had not been much written about Old Testament ideas, symbols that set Latter-day Saints apart from mainline Christianity. Why? I don't know. What had influenced Joseph Smith Jr. and the converts of the early 1800s to embrace a different type of understanding, symbols, beliefs, and language using the Old Testament? Culture is always changing, and we have seen that pace accelerate during the 17th through the 19th centuries.
Oh, okay. All right.
Then I ask everyone on Zoom to please mute. Culture is always changing, and we have seen that pace accelerate. But during the 17th through 19th centuries, change was very slow, and culture was mostly shaped by families and communities and churches. What was it in the early colonies that shaped the Smith family values? Why did the early Latter-day Saints have Old Testament language and culture and values? Did Joseph Smith dismiss all the other churches of the burned-over district as wrong because of their embrace of New Testament Christianity that excluded much of the Old Testament? Perhaps the culture and values of early New England, especially inherited from the Puritans, was the watershed of ideas and values that Joseph Smith Jr. embraced as the church was organized April of 1830. Dr. Philip Gorski, in his book on civil religion, says, quote, "However we retell it today, the Puritans understood their story as that of a new Israel, established in a New England. Drawing on the books of the Pentateuch and the former prophets, which provided a rich trove of plot lines, they saw numerous parallels between themselves and the ancient Israelites. Liberation from slavery, the delivery across the water, the sealing of the covenant, and the wanderings in the wilderness, the conquest of Canaan, and the lost tribes of Israel. The Puritan clergy cast themselves as the Latter-day Prophets, charged with calling the people back to the covenant when they strayed too far from their founding values. Puritan political leaders viewed themselves as latter-day versions of the biblical judges." Gabriel Savan, in his book, The Bible and Civilization, says, quote, "The creation of the United States of America represented a unique event in world history. As a modern republic, it was rooted in the Bible, and one of the earliest tenets was religious tolerance. This is because many of the earliest pilgrims who settled the New England of America in the 17th century were Puritan immigrants and refugees escaping the religious persecutions of Europe. These Puritans viewed their immigration from England as a virtual reenactment of the Jewish exodus from Egypt. To them, England was Egypt, the king was Pharaoh, the Atlantic Ocean was the Red Sea, and America was the land of Israel, and the Indians were the ancient Canaanites. They were the new Israelites entering into a new covenant with God in a new promised land. Thanksgiving, first celebrated in 1621, a year after the Mayflower landed, was initially conceived as a day parallel to the Jewish Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, and was to be a day of fasting, introspection, and prayer. Are you hearing me okay in the back? Rabbi Ken Spiro, in his book World Perfect, and in his online history crash course 55 at aish.com, talks about many of these same things. No Christian community in history identified more with the people of the book than did the early settlers of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, who believed their own lives to be a literal reenactment of the biblical drama of the Hebrew nation. These immigrant Puritans dramatized their own situation as the righteous remnant of the church, corrupted by the Babylonian woe, and saw themselves as instruments of divine providence, a people chosen to build their new commonwealth on the covenant entered into at Mount Sinai. End quote. The Smith family had its roots in New England, and Richard Bushman, in his book Joseph Smith and the Beginnings of Mormonism, tells us, quote, until Aziel's generation scattered to the north and west, the Smith ancestors of the prophet Joseph were rooted in Topsfield, Massachusetts. 15-year-old Robert Smith had sailed from England in 1638 at the height of the Puritan migration, and ended up in Topsfield, a farm village 8 miles north of Salem. Aziel was the 4th generation of Smiths in the town, and his father Samuel had received all the honors that the town could bestow. He was repeatedly chosen assessor, selectman, town clerk, representative of the general court, or the Massachusetts name for the legislature, and delegate to the provincial congress. Most important, he was chosen 20 times as the moderator of the town meeting, a position reserved for one who commanded universal respect. And during the Revolution, he served on the Committee of Safety, and when he died, November 14th of 1785, his obituary in the Salem Gazette noted that he was an esteemed man of integrity and uprightness, a sincere friend to the liberties of his country, and a strenuous advocate of the doctrines of Christianity. End quote.
Scott,
Many.
remember you can change that too.
Okay. I've been pressing it.
Oh, okay.
It must not be working.
Okay.
There it goes.
You just had a good tech round.
Sorry about that.
No, it's all right.
Let's go to the next one.
Okay.
The Smith family had its roots in New. Let's go. I already read that. Many of the earliest laws of New England were based on biblical law. The New Haven legislators adopted a legal code, the Code of 1655, which contains some 79 statutes, half of which contain biblical references, virtually all from the Hebrew Bible. The Plymouth colony had a similar law, as did the Massachusetts Assembly, which in 1641 adopted the so-called capital laws of New England, based almost entirely on Mosaic law. Of course, without a Jewish oral tradition, which helped the Jews understand the Bible, the Puritans were left to their own devices and tended toward a literal interpretation, and this led in some instances to a more strict fundamentalist observance than Judaism had ever seen. Education was of primary importance to the Puritans, as it was for the Israelites of the Old Testament, who were not allowed to build houses of worship until schools were first built for the children. Rabbi Spiro tells of the influence on education in New England. Quote, yeah, it did change. The Hebrew Bible also played a central role in the founding of various educational institutions, including Harvard, Yale, William and Mary, Rutgers, Princeton, Brown, King's College, Johns Hopkins, Dartmouth, etc. Many of these colleges even adopted some Hebrew word or phrase as part of their official emblem or seal. Beneath a banner containing the Latin Lux et Veritas, the Yale seal up here shows an open book with the Hebrew Urim and Thummim, which was the part of the breastplate, of course, of the high priest in the days of the temple. The Columbia seal has the Hebrew name for God at the top center and the Hebrew name of one of the angels on a banner toward the middle. Dartmouth uses the Hebrew words meaning God Almighty in a triangle in the upper center of its seal. So popular was the Hebrew language in the 16th and 17th centuries that several students at Yale delivered their commencement orations in Hebrew. Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Brown, Princeton, Johns Hopkins, and University of Pennsylvania taught courses in Hebrew. All the more remarkable because no university in England at the time offered it. In America, Bible study and Hebrew were course requirements in virtually all these colleges, and students had the option of delivering commencement speeches in either Hebrew, Latin, or Greek. All this pointed to the primacy of the Old Testament, the customs, laws, and traditions of the Israelites. Again, Joseph Smith, after establishing the church, established a school of the prophets in the newly built Kirtland Temple where classes in Hebrew were taught, thereby following in the traditions of the early schools of the colonies. Even after seeing an abundance of evidence from Puritan New England influencing the culture and values of Christians for several generations, it's still difficult to understand the emphasis of Old Testament Christianity over New Testament values of grace, love, and peace to the Puritans. New Testament Christianity was undoubtedly being preached in the burned-over district of New York in the 1820s and 30s. I will not be looking at those churches' teachings or revival preaching, but I suspect that most, if not all, emphasized New Testament scriptures over the Old. Why did the Puritans identify so strongly with the Jews of the Old Testament and use it over the New Testament? The one source that I have found that gives a plausible explanation is Rabbi Ken Spiro in his book, World Perfect. Quote, "While we stress the importance of the Hebrew Bible to the early American settlers, it is important to note that, of course, the Gospels of Jesus were revered as well. However, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, was seen as the original and pure source of Christian values, and also as a legalistic and ritualistic guide, something which the New Testament was not. In addition, there was a political agenda involved in the special focus on the Old over the New Testament. Many New Englanders viewed the New Testament as an instrument of justification used by the powers that be in Europe to preserve the existing order. As the Apostle Paul had written in his letter to the Romans, quote, "Every person must submit to the authorities in power, for all authority comes from God, and the existing authorities are instituted by him. It follows that anyone who rebels against authority is resisting a divine institution, and those who resist have themselves to thank for the punishment they receive." Chapter 13 of Romans. This sure smacked of the divine right of kings and the condemnation of the rebels of the Puritan Revolution. No wonder that the Hebrew Bible, with this message of obedience to God alone, a personal responsibility and freedom from tyranny, was far more in tune with the mindset of these Protestant splinter sects of America. Perhaps this was the reason behind Joseph Smith's statement when asked which church he would join, and he said that they were all wrong together. There are many points of connection between the early Latter-day Saint Church and Old Testament Christianity. Just to list a few. Hebrew would be taught in the Kirtland Temple to the priesthood, just as was taught in the colleges. The Urim and Thummim were used. Prophets and prophecy would again be on the earth. Patriarchs and patriarchal blessings were given, including your adopted tribe of Israel. Priests and high priests were present. Anointing with olive oil, a unique dietary code, temples, Zionism, two priesthoods named after Melchizedek and Aaron became part of the church, and many, many others. I believe that it was this strong connection to the Old Testament that continued to influence Joseph Smith Jr. When Joseph was confronted with Masonic ideas connected to Solomon's Temple of the Old Testament, he embraced it. After all, the head of the Illinois Masonic Lodge, who came to Nauvoo for their Masonic Lodge installation, was Jewish. Joseph was also probably influenced by the Old Testament's experience with polygamy. After all, King Solomon and King David both practiced polygamy for the purpose of treaties and binding agreements to keep peace with other tribes and nations. King David was revered by both Jews and Christians because it was through his lineage that the Messiah would come. From Joseph's childhood surrounded by family and social influence of New England, including Joseph's 9-month convalescence after his leg surgeries in Massachusetts with family, to the time he built the Kirtland Temple, declared independence as center place of Zion, and then established Nauvoo as a political, cultural, and religious community, he was drawn to including all things Old Testament. Many of the early symbols of the 13 colonies during the American Revolution used Old Testament ideas. The first design of the official seal of the United States, recommended by Benjamin Franklin, John Addams, and Thomas Jefferson in 1776, depicts the Jews crossing the Red Sea. The motto around the seal said, "Resistance to tyrants is obedience to God." This example again points to the lack of emphasis of the New Testament because of that scripture in Romans that justified the divine right of kings from Europe. The inscription on the Liberty Bell at Independence Hall in Philadelphia is a direct quote from Leviticus 25:10. Quote, "Proclaim liberty throughout the land unto all the inhabitants thereof." And of course, most prominent and more evident than the opening sentences of the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, ideas from the Old Testament scriptures about ethical monotheism. At the same time that these early ideas of equality of opportunity or liberty were basic to the early colonies, there were also ideas of equality of material things brewing in Europe. And by the year 1844 in Europe, there was published the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844 by Karl Marx, laying out the groundwork of Hegel's ideas of materialism. This would stand in stark contrast to the ideas of liberty from the Old Testament. Liberty, which always results in inequality because of free will and people's choices, versus materialism that forces equality of things and limits personal liberty. We still see this battle today between the ideas of European equality and American liberty, equality in material things or equality of opportunity. As I had mentioned earlier, the Urim and Thummim breastplate and stones of the Jewish high priest were part of the Old Testament history and referenced on the University of Yale's seal in the late 1600s. What becomes curious is that it also was reported by Joseph Smith to be buried with the plates of the Book of Mormon and used by Joseph in its translation. This uniqueness with the Latter-day Saint history is even more curious because nothing in any other Christian church at the time or later refers to or talks about the Urim and Thummim in any theology. Because of this curious and unique item in Latter-day Saint history, tying Joseph Smith and the church to the Old Testament, along with all of these Old Testament symbols, ideas, and beliefs, I believe gives circumstantial proof to a continuation of Puritan Christian Old Testament roots. I have included here some of the Jewish writings and ideas about this sacred and ancient part of the Jewish temple high priest required dress and its use as an oracle with God. I do have a lot of information that I'm going to skip about the Urim and Thummim, but I will sum it up by saying that the 12 stones of the breastplate, each different and representing one of the tribes of Israel, and to the church, the 12 apostles, along with the parchment of the Urim and Thummim, constituted for Joseph Smith a direct connection to Israel, the high priesthood, and God-given prophecy. Could it be that Joseph thought of his seer stone as his God-given part of the oracle of the breastplate? In the early church, as well as in the early days of the LDS church, many patriarchal blessings were given that included the person's lineage in one of the tribes of Israel. And in the LDS church of the 1860s in the Salt Lake Valley, there were very few Jews, but those that had settled there were called Gentiles by the Latter-day Saints, who identified themselves more in the lineage of Israel than even the Jews, a type of replacement theology. Two other New Testament ideas that became part of the sacraments of the Latter-day Saints was the anointing with olive oil, used by the church for the laying on of hands. Both had roots in the New Testament, but originated in the Old Testament with Israel. It was used to anoint kings of Israel, prophets, and was burned in the lamps of the temple. The second was the idea of the Indians as the lost 10 tribes of Israel. From Rabbi Lambert Adler, the Puritans, in another parallel with the history of Thanksgiving, originally claimed that the Native Americans they encountered in New England were descended from the lost 10 tribes of Israel, who Isaiah, among other biblical prophets, prophesied would be reunited at the end of days. According to Rabbi Weitz, quote, the Jewish Indian theory was accepted by scholars such as William Penn and was the subject of written correspondence between John Addams and Thomas Jefferson more than 100 years later. Unfortunately, like the echo of replacement theology in the Pilgrims replacing the Israelites in the Exodus story, this notion that the American Indians were descended from the 10 tribes was overshadowed by the Puritans' efforts toward converting the very people the Bible teaches were supposed to be reunited with the rest of the Jewish world. These long-held ideas from pre-revolutionary New England were part of the social fabric that reached into the consciousness and perhaps the education of settlers' children. Again, Joseph's progenitors were part of this time and place and likely carriers of these beliefs, as were many later converts to the Book of Mormon. President John Addams, who made the first recorded pro-Zionist declaration by an American president, was raised in a Puritan household which used the Bible as its guide. The family observed Shabbat and gave its children Hebrew names. In a series of visions given to Joseph Smith Jr. in the temple at Kirtland, Ohio, April of 1836, Moses, the great prophet of Israel, appeared and committed unto Joseph Smith the keys of the gathering of Israel from the 4 parts of the earth, and the leading of the 10 tribes from the land of the north. From Rasha the Jew by Elder B.H. Roberts, quote, in the year 1840, April the 6th, at a general conference of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints held in Nauvoo, Illinois, Joseph Smith called on Orson Hyde, a Jew, to go up onto a mission to the Holy Land, Palestine, and dedicate the land for the return of the Jews to it, to bring the people and that land once more under the favor and blessings of Jehovah. Elder Orson Hyde, appointed to this mission, was one of the 12 apostles of Jesus Christ in the new dispensation of the gospel, which the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was then and is now bringing forth. Orson Hyde had a vision in March of 1840 in which the Spirit told him he was to visit the cities of London, Amsterdam, Constantinople, and Jerusalem. and that in Jerusalem he was to declare to those of Judah that they must gather together and assemble yourselves and go into the defense cities. This Hyde did with a prayer, October 24th of 1841, in which he dedicated the land of Palestine for the return of the Jews. Hyde stayed in Jerusalem from April 1841 to December 1842, and he recorded that before dawn on October 24th of 1841, he climbed up the Mount of Olives overlooking the city, and then wrote and recited a prayer, which is up here. Having dedicated Jerusalem and Palestine for the ingathering of the Jews, Hyde departed the mountain after building a small altar with stones. Hyde's experience, along with Joseph Smith Jr.'s guidance and counsel, point to the fact that the early church did not plan on proselytizing the Jews, but rather desired to see the Jews gathered back to the promised land of Israel, and thus promoted their repentance and gathering for protection. This was unique at the time, when all the other Christian churches were proselytizing the Jews in Palestine to their Christian beliefs. I believe that Smith, as well as other leaders, pointed to the Old Testament scriptures that predicted the regathering of Israel as a prominent sign of the Messiah's second coming, and so wanted to speed the day of the Lord's return when all would believe in Yeshua, the Messiah. As we look at these many influences from the early Puritans, Old Testament theology, stories, and ideas were part of the building blocks of the Latter-day Saint movement. Many echoes of our past still resonate with ideas of the coming kingdom of God, Zion. Smith, along with many converts, held similar views that bound them together in this new Israel. What have we lost in our deconstruction and our replacement theology? Is there still unique value and calling in Old Testament-centered Christianity? As we see ancient scripture fulfilled in our day, as with the reestablished country of Israel, Jerusalem as its capital, and the ingathering of Jews, what will be our role and our calling for Zion and the second coming of Messiah? I'd like to just close with a quote, and I know I'm out of time. It's short. It's a quote from the book American Covenant by Dr. Philip Gorski in his section titled Conclusion, the Hebraic Moment. Perhaps one might also speak of a Hebraic moment in American political theology. This was, first of all, a time when the national storyline was molded on the Hebrew Scriptures. I say national because the vision of America as a promised land and of its inhabitants as chosen people was soon extended from New England to the nation as a whole and persisted well into the 19th century and beyond. It was, second, a moment of theological debate in which different understandings of Hebrew and Christian scriptures and their relationship to one another were at issue. Was the national covenant based on blood lineage or moral law? Were the apocalyptic texts to be understood allegorically or historically, naturally or supernaturally? The Puritans did not resolve these debates, nor have we. Thus, the Hebraic moment was also and still remains a moment in the physicist's sense of a balancing point. Throughout its history, America has teetered back and forth between civil religion and religious nationalism, sometimes leaning more in one direction or the other, but without losing its balance altogether so far. Thank you.
Welcome. The program is missing two words in the title of my presentation. It should read, instead of, the Temple Lot at Independence, Jackson County, Missouri, its significance to the Restoration. As we contemplate our 50th anniversary, it is proper, I believe, to ask ourselves why we are here in this city, county, state, and here in this building on this particular parcel of land. To answer these questions, we must go back to the early 1830s and to the available recorded information that has been preserved. A basic understanding of the land policies of the United States, and in particular squatters' rights in the situation in western Missouri in 1831 will help us appreciate Joseph Smith's historic trip in the summer of 1831. The early 1830 church was caught up in what was known as the Second Great Awakening. In part, this religious awakening included or encompassed an atmosphere of millennial anxiety, of which the early church and many of its members were caught up in. Specifically, the young prophet Joseph Smith, within months of establishing the restored church in April 1830, was told in a revelation regarding the city of the New Jerusalem. Quote, "No man knoweth where the city of Zion shall be built, but it shall be given hereafter. It shall be beyond the borders of the Lamanites." This designation was understood to be western Missouri and beyond. 4 missionaries were subsequently chosen to preach to the Indian tribes and sent to the borders of the Lamanites in the fall of that same year, 1830. They arrived in Independence in mid-January 1831 and began proselyting to the North American natives and west of the Missouri boundary, as well as the locals in Independence and the surrounding area of Jackson County. Meanwhile, back in Kirtland, additional missionary calls were given by revelation on June the 7th, 1831. Here again, those called, which included Joseph Smith, were to go to western Missouri, and there the Lord would reveal where the city of the New Jerusalem would be located. The Smith party left Kirtland on June 19th and reached Independence in mid-July. Soon after their arrival, Smith received an additional revelation that designated Independence as the center place of what was and is to be the city of the New Jerusalem. The revelation further specified that, quote, "A spot for the temple is lying westward upon a lot which is not far from the courthouse." Certainly within days, Smith would have announced his plan for a dedication ceremony of that spot for a temple. At this point of reference, just so we all get a picture, the small village of Independence consisted of 3 stores, 20 houses, and a couple of taverns. Population estimates go from 2 to 300. We're not talking lots of people. The story of the dedication and the later acquisition of the original temple lot property has heretofore been a story only partly told. Historically, the particulars regarding the August 3rd dedication and then the subsequent acquisition of the property has been and continues to be often misunderstood when recited as part of the early Missouri Mormon experience. First, the mid-July arrival in Independence of Joseph Smith in a company of several men, and within days, an additional large group of Mormon pioneers referred to as the Colville Saints would have caused a considerable stir in Little Independence. Second, this group of new arrivals was preaching a doctrine of millennialism, and specifically that the New Testament city of the New Jerusalem was to be located in their immediate vicinity. It would seem unrealistic that the news of Smith's revelation would not have been a topic of conversation, at least among some of the townsfolk and others in the surrounding area, as the members intermixed with the people that found the stores and others. To understand the circumstances surrounding this planned event, we must go back to what we know about the basic land policies of the United States in 1830, the formation of Jackson County, and the founding of Independence. The actual settlement of Jackson County was directly impacted by what was called squatters' rights. In simple terms, a squatter was an individual who selected a piece of public land in a yet-to-be-surveyed area of the expanding United States, and then settled upon it with the hope of eventually being able to legally purchase the squatted land from the U.S. government. This was a common land acquisition practice during the early years of our republic. Legal ownership of a person's squatter's property, however, was only accomplished after waiting many years. Thus, the person was called a squatter. The set price by the United States government in the early 1800s was $1.25 per acre. Squatters were given the first opportunity to purchase their land claim before any other individuals or land speculators could bid on the acreage so designated. But let's talk more specifically about Jackson County. Jackson County was organized by the Missouri State Legislature on December 15, 1826, carved out of larger counties that were originally set when Missouri became a state. The county was surveyed in 1826 and 1827 and included the village of Independence. In July 27, the county seat was officially located at Independence. After the completion of the U.S. Land Survey in Jackson County, which took place in late 1827, the sale of the surveyed land was made available for those that are squatters and others in November, a year later, 1828. Except, and here's the part that gets often misconstrued and misunderstood, this sale of public land by the U.S. government did not include those sections set apart by the federal government and transferred to state control, which were designated as 1, school land, and 2, seminary land. A section includes 640 acres, just as a reference. In 1821, when Missouri was admitted as a state of the Union, Section 16 of every township was reserved for school land. In addition, 2 townships, representing 72 sections, were reserved for the use of a seminary of learning, with a minimum price of $2 per acre. Again, these sections were all transferred by the federal government to the state and became part of the state's ownership. These seminary sections, skipping past the school sections, were also held back from public sale for a period of time, as per the assignment, in hopes of even generating more revenue than the $2 per acre, when finally sold by the state at a later date. The defined meaning of the term seminary in the early 1800s meant college or university. That's the beginning of the University of Missouri. 58%, or 42 sections, of the total sections of 72 designated seminary lands were disproportionately assigned to Jackson County. Amazing. The whole state is all... and the town of Independence was surrounded by seminary land sections. This was a great disappointment to the locals, as you can imagine. These early pioneers or squatters were now going to have to wait again for several more years to be able to obtain legal title to their property. Furthermore, when eventually purchased, the minimum price was going to be $2 per acre versus $1.25. That's a 62% increase. Big deal back in that time. Despite the theory behind seminary designation, that is, the eventual auction or sale would drive up prices in these choice sections above the $2, it wasn't to be, at least in Independence. Reality was that squatters' rights prevailed. Finally, in June 1831, the local population was informed by the state of Missouri that their seminary land located in the vicinity of Independence would be available at last for purchase in December of 1831. Certainly the original missionaries, those 4 plus 1 that arrived in January, would have known about this. This would have been big news. According to a report prepared by the state auditor, you'll love this, for the Missouri legislature, at the time of the sale of seminary land in Jackson County, much of the land was worth $5 to $10 per acre. But the settlers, and this is Jackson County, threatened violence to any person who paid more than the government minimum price even proposing to jail the circuit judge if he interfered. I love that one, one of my all-time finds. Apparently, although no known documentation has been located, Smith was given further and specific information or instruction as to the location westward upon a lot which is not far from the courthouse. I mean, that's pretty vague. And the revelatory direction led him to the squatter's claim of Jones Flournoy, who had 160 acres, quarter of a section. So who is Jones Flournoy? And what does he have to do with the story? Jones Flournoy, along with his parents and siblings, were among the first of the early pioneers to come to Jackson County as early as 1824. Jones was a gunsmith, a farmer, a well-known supplier of various goods for those individuals and companies anticipating going further west on the Santa Fe Trail, and he was also the postmaster. So he's probably one of the best-known persons in the community. At this juncture, I thought that it would have been absolutely necessary, given the particulars of the revelation regarding that temple site, for Joseph Smith, with other church leaders, certainly probably included Bishop Partridge, to have arranged in advance a meeting with Flournoy. Such a meeting would have provided Smith and Partridge the opportunity to ask Flournoy for his permission to venture onto his squatter's land before a dedicatory prayer or service could have really taken place. And it might have included a preliminary arrangement for the purchase of a portion of that property. Adding to this necessity of pre-access was the additional fact that to the immediate north of Jones Flournoy's squatter's land was a squatter's acreage claimed by his brother, Solomon, the local constable. To venture onto or make claim to someone else's land, albeit squatter's land, would have been considered trespassing. And as been noted previously, the local citizens of Jackson County were apparently willing to take the law into their own hands when it came to controlling any opposition to the future acquisition of their squatters' claims. One must therefore assume that in the summer of 1831, after already waiting several years to buy their squatters' land, which just happened to be that they settled on seminary land, and well aware that they were going to be required to pay an exorbitant $2 per acre instead of $1.25, the locals would not have tolerated any outsider interfering with their plans. So continuing our story. There are various accounts of who participated in the announced dedication for the spot for a temple on August the 3rd, 1831. The event, after all, I'd first throw in here these are of course not 1830 photos, but some early photos of the temple lot. These are 1880, 1890 photos. And so now we come up to the temple dedication. This event, after all, was the primary and motivating purpose for the trek from Ohio to Missouri in the summer of 1831. From the records, it appears that there's at least 13 people, and perhaps even more, and not the traditional 8 that are always accounted for. Once assembled, the group proceeded, in my opinion, with permission, to the squatter's claim of Jones Flournoy. According to W.W. Phelps and others, Sidney Rigdon dedicated the ground for the city of the New Jerusalem, and Joseph Smith dedicated the site for the Millennial Temple. Next, marker stones were apparently placed on both the northeast and southeast corners, and finally a tree near the northeast corner was blazed. These symbolic actions, marker stones and blazing, are the specific points, coupled with a lack of understanding of squatters' rights and seminary land, that have confused the story of the dedication and the acquisition of the temple lot property for the past 191 years. Today, that spot for the temple is located on the grounds of the Church of Christ temple lot. While not disputing the events of blazing the tree or laying the stones, an understanding of whose property they were on and the needed permission to be there is never mentioned. Just 6 days later, on August the 9th, Joseph Smith and party left Independence for Kirtland, leaving Bishop Partridge behind to reside over the church and also the assigned task of purchasing the land for the church when it came available, which was to buy it from Flournoy in December. But he had to buy it first. And so 4 months later, on December 19th, 1831, Bishop Edward Partridge acquired 63.27 acres of land which encompassed the temple site from Flournoy as planned. So what would have had to happen? Flournoy would have to go to those that had been assigned by the state, and the meeting was actually held here in Independence, and you would present what you got to do to prove your acreage. Of course, nobody's going to argue with Jones Flournoy. And he buys at $2 an acre his 160 acres. And then he turned right around, sold 2 different pieces of it to 2 of his friends in town, and sold on the 19th of December 63.25 acres to Edward Partridge for on behalf of the church. I firmly believe it was absolutely essential that Joseph Smith would have had to get permission to go on that property before any further action could have ever taken place. And then we go on with the rest of the story. As we all know, in November of 1833, the Saints are driven out of Jackson County. And what happens to the property? Well, when you don't pay property taxes, okay. And so the property basically reverts back to the state, but not totally, because certain people wanted to make sure that they were protected. Eventually go up to winter quarters in 46, and make a deal with Partridge, and so other things develop after that. But the reality is that with the Saints gone from Jackson County, the first group of any Latter-day Saint or Mormon group is the Church of Christ temple lot. And based on a revelation from Granville Hedrick related in 1864, they were returned in 1867. So we'll first talk about that. Why? This is just a sketch that was sent to Joseph, to Partridge and others in 1833. And so when the Saints are driven out in 1834, Joseph, of course, mounts the effort to come back and redeem Zion in 1834, known as Zion's Camp. And then jumping ahead to what Granville Hedrick and others must have looked like when they made their trip back in 1867. This is the oldest available sketch of the Independence area in 1868. And we're going to go, you see that upper bend up in that far corner? That's what this looks like. And then the open area right over here, this area here is what we're talking about. And theoretically, the only known photograph of Granville Hedrick. This is the first church that they built, 1889, some almost 30 years later. This is the second building. The first one was burned down by an arsonist. And then the third building, that's the baptismal font on the temple lot. And then this is the third building, which replaced the second building, which is also burned down by an arsonist. Tough duty being on the temple lot property there. Then, starting with 1877, Joseph Smith III authorized it's now safe to return to Missouri, we think. And the Church of Christ Temple had been there 10 years. There were others that were already here of the RLDS Church, but at this point it became an official okay to go ahead. And while this is not the first church that was built in Independence, this is the Stone Church, was the closest they could get, was right across the street from the Temple lot. And then, of course, the auditorium in 1962. And then that gets us down to the LDS Church, and the temple, of course, which we're in today, which is the point I was making to start with, why we're here on this spot of land. 1900, Lorenzo Snow authorized the return of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but that's generally unknown amongst members of the LDS Church. It was not a formal announcement, but he authorized Mission President James Duffin to move from Kansas to the mission home into Jackson County in 1900. And then by 1904, he was given the go-ahead to purchase land and property on the original Temple Lot property, and that was done in April 1904. In 1907, the new mission president, Samuel O'Banion, moved the mission headquarters from Kansas City into Independence. This is the mission home. And in 1914, the LDS Church built their first chapel up the street from the 20 acres that they originally purchased. And in 67, they dedicated the land. This is on part of the 20 acres they bought. And in 72, they dedicated the visitor center. And this kind of gives you an overall picture of where everything is. From the building that we're in here today, the beautiful Community of Christ Temple. Across the street is the LDS Visitor Center. And coming this direction is the auditorium. And then the Church of Christ Temple lot property. And this area here is more or less the 63 acres that was purchased. And I think I'll just wrap me up for right now and take your questions until you give us the go-ahead. Thank you very much.